My name is Kysiak. I've been in this economic development business since 1969. Probably one of the oldest members, at least through CUED. I worked for 3 communities: Economic Development Director in Milwaukee, Economic Development Director in New Haven, Connecticut, and head of a not-for-profit private economic development organization, and executive director of a research park in Evanston, Illinois. Well, there weren't any, we didn't have any economic development per se, at least in where I was living in Milwaukee back in '69. The mayor had put together a small commando group, if you want to call it that, to suddenly meet a real need to hold industry back from leaving the city, because we had civil disturbances in 1967 and burned up a lot of property. Manufacturer says we don't need this, and they began to move out. So, long story short, the mayor understood, in talking with his other mayors, that he needed to have something positive and focus directly on trying to hang on to those businesses. Unfortunately, the people that were out there, a lot of them didn't know much about how you do that. Didn't know much about business. Because they were public sector, they didn't deal with the business world very much. But it was the first time, at least in Milwaukee history, when they focused directly down on an economic development agenda. And there were others who were doing the same things in Baltimore, Washington, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, St. Louis. And those people ultimately came together and formed the Council for Urban Economic Development in 1967. This was a new ball game for big city mayors. They didn't know really what to do about it. So we started out that way as a small, agile organization, and we sort of picked up on those projects that the mayor felt very concerned about, but in effect had no capacity to deal with. Like, how do we keep that industry here? Well, they need a street vacated. They need money. They can't get the kind of workforce they want. They want someone to help pay their insurance. Any number of things. So we were the ones who sort of made it up as we went along, because we didn't know. My background, I had a degree in radio, TV journalism. I mean, but I really got to like it because yes, it was a job. But it was almost a mission. You were designated by the chief executive of the city to go out there and help keep our businesses in place, help create even more jobs for the breadwinners who work and live in the city. And instead of selling motorcycles or blenders or small engines, which were 3 companies I worked for before I got into economic development, there was real purpose to my life. And so economic development started out from a very shaky, unusual situation. It has now morphed into this profession, which is a key here, that word profession. We're not just like real estate brokers. We're not just like, some guy, fixing your toilet, whatever it is. We're professional people. We have professional standards. We have professional training. None of that existed in 1967. It all came through CUED. And so watching all of that happen was probably that really was the strength of the economic development business overall. It was turning out professionally trained economic development people. But we didn't get to that stage until the 80s. In the meantime, it was catch as catch can, best practices. QED met once a year in Washington. We got together. Mainly, we were a big city urban organization. As time went on, we began to bring in smaller cities, then states. But our real focus was urban in those days. It was through the merger with IEDC back around the turn of this last century, about 1999, 2000, when we pulled that word urban out. And that's why we're called what we're called. We are a Council on Economic Development, not Urban Economic Development. Well, it's about creating wealth. And you create wealth through private investment. A lot of people don't have a chance to create wealth. They may have a 9-to-5 job, they work in a factory like my father did all his life. There was no way to get up that ladder. In economic development, the end game was an overall healthy, wealthy city, a city that worked, where if you wanted a job, you had one. A city that looked forward, that invested in infrastructure, invested in the school systems, created a nice, friendly atmosphere within which to live, where people felt safe and comfortable. So yeah, it's somewhat about the metrics, so many jobs, et cetera, but has just as much to do, if not more, with that feeling people will have about your city. When you travel the country and you drive into a town or a city, what do you see? Well, on the way in, you may or may not see factories. You may see a lot of strict commercial. You may see storefronts that are empty. But you get to the downtown, and there's nothing going on down there. That tells you something about this community. It doesn't have a central place to gather. It doesn't have, it is not working on all of its cylinders, all right? Because when you leave that place, the image in your mind when someone mentions that town or that city is you're going to think of that downtown and the fact that nothing's going on there. Now, there may be thousands of people who would live there and who love it and were happy about it. But the cities, the downtowns were the signature of a community, which is why we spend so much time on them, especially during the UDAG years and others. People want to see a vibrant, interesting downtown. Luckily now we have the millennials, and you're seeing a lot of development of high-rise condos, like in Evanston, for example, that started out with 3 restaurants when I was there, and now has 75. They just needed a kickstart, and the young people who said, I don't want to be in the burbs anymore. I want to live downtown. And once they began to live downtown, downtown now became a neighborhood. And once they were a neighborhood, they had political clout. And therefore, a lot of downtowns, from Chicago all the way through to tinier communities, those downtowns they're injecting a lot of public infrastructure money, and you're getting private investment, which will make it a better place overall. Yes, it'll help the store owners. Yes, it'll help the clerks. Yes, it'll help shopping. But the main thing it does is gives people an image of your community as being one of wealth, where everybody, in effect, is sharing in the pie. So, well, a couple of things. One is don't get discouraged. Economic development actions you take today may not show themselves in a positive way 10 years, sometimes 20 years. I was working on projects in Milwaukee in the early 1970s, which are only coming into fruition today, 40 years later, because the climate is right. The need for the land is right. Everything else is working now. There are incentives in place. All of that stuff we built. It took a long time to get it there. So number one, have a lot of patience. Number two, don't get discouraged. You have to be flexible, and you have to be ready to keep going into the lists every day. Get up, fix it the best you can. And third is, I guess, best practices are not necessarily best for you. So if people say, well, I've been to Aurora, look at what they've done, let's go and do what they did. It's very, very seldom that the same model works the same way in a different place, okay? Because geography is funny that way, but it means a lot. City's culture, everything else. So the changes in economic development have been immense. It started out as a real estate issue, keep companies here. Went through small business development, minority business development, up into financing of all different kinds, incentives, providing downtown revitalization, all the way through industrial parks, and all of a sudden now you have business parks in communities. And those morphed into research parks where they had universities, and suddenly the universities, in effect, became part of the team that you had to have on board. You had to relearn your job every couple of years. That's daunting, but it's also one of the biggest reasons that the job is so interesting. It's never the same. Well, from my perspective, where I worked, Milwaukee and New Haven, Evanston, different sizes, different advantages, but all of them had a part of the central city, broken down, unemployment, drugs, violence. That problem has been with us probably since the end of the Second World War. And numerous people have attempted to attack it from many different angles. It's very, very difficult to make that system work because economic development by itself can't do it. You can put all the supermarkets you want in place, but if people are not going to go to them or afraid to go to them, it doesn't make any difference. If a business is there, they tend to move out. Because this problem is so complex, you need a coalition. In New Haven, I worked for 6 years there and did some good stuff, but I learned a lesson. I learned that what I knew how to do was not enough to take a city and bring it back to where it wanted to be. That you needed to have education, law enforcement, foundations, infrastructure, job training, social services, a raft, multivariate raft of programmatic approaches under one vision, all of them in a way working at this problem at one time, which might begin to help that problem get resolved. But it took 100 years for that problem, if you want to call it that, started, if not maybe 150 years. It's going to take a long time to make that part of it work. And that is, I think, by far from an economic development standpoint, you can put all the money you want into it, unless you fix the other pieces, early childhood education and a lot of other things, it's just not going to work. Well, very honestly, I wouldn't have had much of a career if I didn't have, I used the word QED because I was about done by the time AEDC merged. But we didn't know how to do what we were supposed to do back in those days. Some of us, like me, I worked in some manufacturing plants. I knew something about how manufacturing worked. I knew something about the pecking orders and stuff. But what we didn't have was a source of trained, sophisticated professionals that we could look to. And even our peers were out sort of wandering around out there. And then when QED got formed in '67, which was before I joined it, 2 years before I joined it, and those 6 or 7 guys, from Philadelphia, Baltimore, Boston, New York, Chicago, St. Louis, Milwaukee, when they met and said, we need to do something, but we need to work, we need to learn from each other. So that was the beginning of CUED, and as time went on, they began to do something which was very important, was the whole process of creating SECDs, professional economic developers who have gone through a rigid training program, passed tests, which aren't easy. A lot of people have to go through 2 or 3 times. Created a source of qualified professional economic development folks. We didn't have that. It was because we had an organization, however, that could spend full time on creating that kind of a system that we in turn were able to begin to really do some work, because we knew we could take anybody off the street almost and turn them over to CUED or IEDC through their steps of training, and we'd have a professional with a capital P in that sense. So the SECD program, I think, obviously the sharing amongst and between that we got through coming to conferences like this. This was, before the internet. We didn't have any way of keeping track of each other. We'd call each other on the phone once in a while. I got this problem, that problem. But there was never very little face-to-face contact, except once a year we all came here to Washington. So that I think is the major contribution that AEDC and QED have made to the economic development profession. It wasn't a profession until these organizations made it a profession. And our friends at AEDC had such a system in place, by the way, when to train people for their work. We did not, and we rapidly caught up, and then together we merged, and now it all works together. Well, as I said, you have to learn how to do different things every few years. It's hard to guess where it's going to go. One common answer to that is, well, technology is going to make it all so different for us. Well, it's made a lot of difference, and I agree with that. But now you got the millennials, people who now want to live in a downtown, for example, people who want to live in an urban center or a town center. How do you keep these people? So there's a whole area of amenities that I wouldn't say we would discount, but that weren't that important. Now these amenities are very important. Do you have gay bars in your community? Who in the hell would ever thought about that? Okay. And, do you have places young people can gather and you get to meet each other and all that kind of stuff? Do you have access to the university and its opportunities to take classes and other things? So creating the amenities, which is what all the small towns are trying to do now, to lure in the millennials, because they're people from age 25 to 35 or 40 have moved out. They've gone to places where they can get better work at more money. A lot of our small towns in Wisconsin are shriveling up, drying up, going away. They can't keep the young people in their communities, and they have to somehow. And I don't have any answer to that, but I think that's where most of our focus has to come to an understanding of what we're really trying to accomplish here. We all can't be Richard Florida's lab mouse. There are places where you're never going to get gay bars. You're never going to have 10-story condos, and you're never going to have all these other things. So what do those people do? You just don't throw them away. You have to find alternative ways in order to make that community work. And that's where the creativity is going to come in, and I think that's where the complexity is going to be. So.